Good morning, and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Society of Geneva. We seek to meet you wherever you are on your journey and invite you to be part of this congregation in which we draw wisdom from all the world's religions, balanced with the insights of modern science. We seek to build a diverse, beloved community within our virtual walls and hope to inspire and accompany one another as we act for peace and justice in our larger world. I've always been a Unitarian Universalist. The joke in my family is that this was the only church my New England Quaker grandfather and Southern Methodist grandmother could agree on. My parents, in what was probably a double effort of seeing Grandpa and Grandma more often and getting us kids some moral exposure, followed their example. I don't remember much, to be honest. The sign of a misspent youth, I'm sure, but I don't think my parents were very involved in the church. I don't remember them going to encounter groups or workshops or primal scream therapy or camping or whatever it was that was going on back in the 70s. Aside from my dad teaching softball during the summer and the occasional fundraising dinners, I think I spent more time there than they did. As a member of the liberal religious youth, what some of you may remember only as LRY, I got to hang out with some friends, go on trips, do sleepovers at the church, sing in youth chapel, take classes on all manner of world religion and philosophy, do day trips to other churches, play a whole lot of softball with dad, and lead Dungeons and Dragons adventures for the younger kids. In short, church was fun. My neighborhood friends thought this was weird, but then none of them were UUs, except for my friend Jeremy, whose family attended a Reform synagogue across town. All of my friends were Catholic. Sunday school was many things, they told me, but fun wasn't one of them. Maybe it's odd, but I also don't remember being asked, what is a UU? Which is good, because if I had to answer that, I probably have ended up writing an essay. Maybe it was just us being kids. We just didn't spend a lot of time talking about church, but I do remember a great deal of oohing and eewing when I described the About Your Sexuality curriculum. AYS was the basis for OWL, for those keeping track. I got a lot of mileage out of that material, and I want to say that my collection of benighted friends, and perhaps more importantly, all of their eventual partners, greatly benefited from my timely, informed, and very detailed discussions sourced directly from those classes. That's me, always giving. It wasn't until I was much older that I remember being asked what UUs were all about, why I went to church, why the complicated and difficult to say name, what I believed, what it felt like to be a heretic, where we came from. What I find striking today, serving publicly as a UU minister, is how often no one asks, which is a shame because now I have so much more to say. But before I get sidetracked, now would be a good time to pause and do our thing. With our mics still muted, I'm going to remove the Zoom spotlight for a moment. And what I want you to do is to hit the button in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, the one that says View, and pull that menu down and click on the word Gallery. And if you haven't activated your camera, now is a brilliant time to do so. You'll know everything is working right because all of a sudden there will be a ton of little boxes all over your screen. Now, looking at these faces, your community, and in the spirit of our friend, the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III of Trinity Church here in Chicago, I want you to turn to one of those boxes, your neighbor, doesn't matter which one, and say, neighbor, oh neighbor, with critique comes invitation. Amen. Thank you. appreciate the indulgence. This morning, I'm going to talk about a particular event, now 60 years in our past. The day when Unitarianism and Universalism stopped being separate things and became one thing. How we got there. And some questions for where we're going next. It might help to start at a beginning. Not the beginning, but a beginning. And one of those beginnings happened in 1805 when Hosea Ballou published a book called A Treatise on Atonement, where he suggested that perhaps making God out to be dangerous and vengeful was at odds with Jesus's teachings about the God of love. A few years later, we had another beginning. In 1819, William Ellery Channing published his sermon, Unitarian Christianity, wherein he dared to suggest that reason mattered at least as much as tradition. These two preachers, Ballou and Channing, were rabble-rousers, to be sure, disturbers of the peace, challengers of the status quo. And they drew a lot of criticism, a lot of fear and anger. One was labeled Universalist, the other Unitarian. Both were called heretic. And that is where we come from. So I want to say a word about those words, heresy and heretic. As you may know, they derive from a Greek word that means to choose. And choosing was a problem. Well, the story of that is peculiar to Christianity, actually. With the Christian religion, and this was a novel thing 2,000 years ago, this one thing, what you thought mattered at least as much as what you did. What you thought mattered at least as much as what you did. In fact, if you had the wrong thoughts, you might get the wrong rewards. So a lot of emphasis was put on straightening out beliefs. Ortho, Greek for straight. Doxy, Greek for thoughts. Orthodoxy. So choosing differently was something not done lightly. And it was a big deal when the Orthodox Christian faith came apart under critiques, new choices, new heresies from folk like Martin Luther and John Calvin. These critiques, though, kept coming. And almost 300 years later, the heresies of people like Ballou and Channing led to the formation of the Universalist General Convention and the American Unitarian Association. I'm not going to do a lot with it today, but the histories of those two churches are reasonably well documented. And if you're curious or just collecting, there are two books available in the UUA bookstore. The first is called A Stream of Light, A Short History of American Unitarianism by Conrad Wright. The second is The Larger Faith, A Short History of American Universalism by Charles Howe. These books give the story of our humble beginnings and our clumsy fumblings toward each other. On the surface, the idea of the Universalists and the Unitarians having anything in common was not obvious. As Thomas Starr King, one of the first ministers to hold standing in both traditions, once said, "The one thinks God is too good to damn us forever. The other thinks they are too good to be damned forever." Quoting now from the 1975 report on the Commission on Appraisal, quote, "This was his way of saying, with respect to salvation, that the Universalists put more stress on the love and grace of God, and the Unitarians put more stress on the humanity's natural goodness." In a Huffington Post retrospective back in 2011, Reverend Marilyn Sewell explains that the two groups actually did have a lot in common. She wrote that, quote, "Most significantly, each was a free faith. with no creed, and both had a strong policy of congregational autonomy. And both groups allowed the umbrella of their religion to encompass an increasingly diverse range of beliefs, including atheists, agnostics, humanists, Jews, as well as Christians. The eventual merger then was a practical move to strengthen two small denominations that had limited resources. A practical move, perhaps, but not necessarily a straightforward one. So it may come as some surprise to today's UUs that the first overtures towards union came back in 1865 during the annual Unitarian conference. Nothing came of it, but a few decades later, following the World's Parliament of Religions held here in Chicago, that's 1893, the Universalists, the Unitarians, leaders in Reform Judaism, and their counterparts in the ethical culture movement all came together to talk about what was argued then, the fact that their separateness was impeding the growth of religious liberalism. For whatever it's worth, talks about merger foundered when we wouldn't give up references to Jesus. However, in 1895, 1897, and 1908, both the Unitarians and the Universalists were proposing motions at each of their respective annual conferences, hinting at a merger. But again, nothing much came of it. Now, everything changed in the 1930s. With pressure at home and abroad due to the Great Depression and the threat of global war, attendance and funding for liberal churches became scarce. And the Unitarians and the Universalists were in danger of becoming historical footnotes. Three things happened in the 1930s that marked a turning point. First was the humanists, a powerful vision codified in the 1933 Humanist Manifesto. This was used to seed hundreds of new lay-led Unitarian fellowships and a few Universalist ones all over the country. Second, both the Unitarians and the Universalists elected dynamic new leaders, leaders that transformed and revitalized their institutions. These leaders created consistency, organization, and vision, and their denominations responded. We'll talk about them at a future time. Lastly, as part of their revitalization efforts, these leaders founded the Free Church of America, the first serious attempt at merging the two denominations. The fact that we don't really know that name pretty much tells you all you need to know about the effort. The FCA was created as an association that member churches could opt into, one created to entice back to the table other liberal religious organizations like Reform Judaism and ethical culture that I just mentioned a few minutes ago. After the FCA fizzled, largely due to lack of interest, attention, and funding, the Universalist Church of America, however, had another idea. They were invited to apply for membership to what became the National Council of Churches. The Universalists were really looking for ways to effectively engage with their peers to, quote, address the pressing human needs resulting from World War II. That group, however, rejected their application, not once, but twice. The Universalists were not sufficiently Christian, the Baptists and Episcopalians said. Instead, they were, quote, too much like the Unitarians. I like to think it was this rejection that finally pushed the Universalists into the arms of the Unitarians for good. So in 1947, we got serious. Voting across the individual Unitarian and Universalist member churches indicated broad support for consolidation. In 1954, the separate youth organizations actually combined to create LRY. In 1956, the Joint Merger Commission was formed and began laying out specific plans. And by 1961, the deal was done. On May 12th, 60 years ago, the two denominations became one. 60 years on, Pew Research says that there are over 800,000 people worldwide who identify as UU. It's a large number, but of that number, only 153,000 claim membership in a particular UUA congregation. And it's pretty interesting to note that this is almost exactly the same number from the time of the merger. The total number of churches has also remained more or less constant across that time. While the hoped for massive growth clearly didn't happen, massive loss also didn't happen, and that's striking. Over the last 60 years, mainline denominations have seen huge drops in membership. Now, I don't want to read too much into that, but our constancy is pretty interesting. 60 years ago, most of the UUA pulpits were filled by white men. Today, a significant majority of UUA pulpits are filled by women, and a very significant percentage of those pulpits are filled by those who identify as LGBTQI. And while the UUA is still the whitest denomination on record, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color are a small but now clearly growing segment. 60 years ago, the UUA was facing some very serious social issues. And yeah, that's a good way to put it. Civil rights movement. And after that, the UUA, like much of America, pivoted away from anti-racism to the Vietnam War. And this caused significant friction. But about the Vietnam War, our own Beacon Press was the press that published the Pentagon Papers. If you are unfamiliar or wanting a refresher, I highly recommend the 2017 film, The Post, starring Meryl Streep and Tom Hanks. If you haven't already seen it, it was great. War gave way to feminism, though, and then to gay rights, and everything kept going, right? We just had a lot on our plates. We always have, like our abolitionist ancestors of the 19th century. Social change has always been in our hearts. I suppose that today isn't all that different. Today's UUA is still facing a blizzard of social issues. Black Lives Matter, and rather briefly, Me Too. The new Poor People's Campaign, the fight against global climate change, the rise of authoritarianism, attacks on Muslims, the attack on truth, hate toward Asians, insurrection, pandemic. And the UUA has responded, and in some cases, brilliantly. In fact, our willing response, our desire to have an impact on national and world events has been a defining feature since our beginning. Tyler Cohen, writing an op-ed in Bloomberg last week, had this to say about some recent campaigns about identity in politics. Quote, "Wokeness isn't going to disappear. So the sooner wokeness becomes like the Unitarian Church, broadly admired, but commanding only a modicum of passion and commitment, the better." This comment was then repeated by New York Times columnist David Brooks. Maybe you saw that. My colleagues, clergy colleagues did, and they're largely affronted and insulted and have responded accordingly. No one enjoys negative criticism, but I believe that when someone calls you out for your behavior, even if it's only in a passing comment, dismissing that critique by insulting their character is probably bad form. So I sat with this throwaway line in the op-ed. And the more I thought about it, the more I believe that it is not an insult, but a statement of mild curiosity and just bland ignorance. UUs are big on justice. Everybody knows this. We're admired for it. But do we stand for anything else? This is, I believe, the real critique posed by the offhand comment in the Bloomberg op-ed. UUs have never really had a clear answer, at least not one that the public at large has been able to put squarely next to our long name. Not 60 years ago, not today. Our friends of other faiths stand for a lot of things: tradition, resurrection and salvation, obligations to God, the end of suffering. What UUs seem to have instead are a lot of questions. And that's actually something we're quite proud of. We are the faith with the holy question mark standing at its center. But is that only a thin and shallow sort of faith? One only asking for, quote, a modicum of passion and commitment? I think we are more than that, but my answer is actually not the point. The point is, what is it exactly that UUs as a whole proclaim? 60 years on, I suppose you could say that UUs are still struggling with a coherent public identity. Who are we? Are we activists? Are we a social club? Are we actually a religious faith? Some kind of broad coalition of social movements? Or are we something more? This is, I think, a particularly curious question to take up now, some 200 years since our two denominations sprang forth and 60 years into our merger. But with critique comes invitation, an invitation to choose. We are all heretics after all, and choosing is what we do. I don't really have any answers for you. And yes, I'm aware that this is probably the most quintessentially UU thing I've said all morning. No answers, just questions. But I like to think today, this is a fair place to leave that conversation, open-ended. Unitarian Universalism in the 21st century has a choice to make. We can be the faith that stands up for justice and not much else. That's good and important work, and our world will be the better for our help. But I like to think we can do more than this. But what? 60 years ago, our friends, family, ancestors gifted us with a very particular vision, one that we amended in 1985 to create our current 7 principles and 6 sources. But I think it's inspiring to see where we came from. So today I'll close with Article 2 of the 1961 UUA bylaws, which reads in part, "The association dedicated to the principles of a free faith unites in seeking a free and disciplined search for truth as the foundation of religious fellowship, to cherish and spread the universal truths taught by the great prophets and teachers of humanity in every age, immemorially summarized in the Judeo-Christian heritage as love to God and love to man, to affirm, defend, and promote the supreme worth of every human being, to strive for a world community founded on ideals of brotherhood, justice, and peace, and to encourage cooperation among people of goodwill in every land." This is our faith. Where we take it is up to us. And as we prepare to leave this place, continue your journey in love. Care for one another and care for this, our earth. Do justice and make peace. And as you go, know that whatever taste or touch you've had in this time and place of hope, joy, love, or peace, that goes with you out into the world. We are different for having spent this time together. So remember, live boldly and with thanksgiving.